Okay, so yeah, so I'm Helen Santini. I'm the Specialist Advisor for Juvenile Huntington's disease with the Huntington's Disease Association. It's all a bit strange doing it this way, but it's really great that you could make this, and it's just a really great opportunity to just say, give a bit of an overview really about juvenile Huntington's disease. Okay, so first of all, just to go through what we're going to talk about today. So first of all, we'll look at what is juvenile Huntington's disease, really, the basics, explaining what it is. I imagine quite a few of you probably have a bit of an understanding of Huntington's disease anyway, but if you want to, we do have other webinars going on about a bit more in detail about just Huntington's disease generally. Then speak a little bit about the genetics of juvenile Huntington's disease and how that differs from adults, and looking at the, and then really moving on to look at the impact of juvenile Huntington's disease on the family, and things like sort of school and transition, areas that are a bit more specific to juvenile Huntington's disease rather than as opposed to adults with the condition. And then finally, just looking at some of the resources and support that are available, which will hopefully be helpful. Okay, so what is juvenile Huntington's disease? So as hopefully most people will know, Huntington's disease usually presents as an adult. So we'd usually expect symptoms to start somewhere between around 30 and 50. But you can develop Huntington's at any age. So it can be much younger, but equally it can be much older as well. So juvenile Huntington's disease is where people develop symptoms before the age of 20. Now there's no particular reason, there's nothing magic about 20. It's really just a sort of an arbitrary definition which came about as people started to write about and sort of notice, doctors started to notice people with juvenile Huntington's disease and write about it, just as a way to define it really. But hopefully you can see that that's actually, you know, if you're talking about any age really up to the age of 20, that's a huge big age range. And actually some very different developmental stages, different stages in people's lives. So, and I think that's, as we go on, you'll see that that becomes important. So loosely, I'm going to talk about sort of young children who may be a sort of under 10 when they develop symptoms, what I'll loosely term teenagers. So someone maybe between about 10 and 20 when they develop symptoms. And then even there might be some people who are maybe coming up to 20 when they start very early signs, but now actually maybe in their 20s or even their 30s. So there's a real range of ages and situations. So how common is juvenile Huntington's disease? I think the simplest thing to say is it's a rare condition. It's difficult to know exactly how rare. If you look at prevalence studies, they'd probably suggest about 5 to 10% of all people with Huntington's disease would have juvenile onset. But certainly we have mixed messages about that. So if you look, on the one hand, people might say, well, the more you look into a population, or, you know, when you're doing things like prevalence studies, the more you'll find that actually there are more people than you think. So maybe it's an underestimate. But then on the other hand, a lot of specialist services, so that's specialist clinics and even the Huntington's Disease Association as well, 5% doesn't really match up with with our figures. So I would say that we probably have less than 5% of the people that we have with adult onset Huntington's. But just to give you an idea, we're in contact with about 84 people in England and Wales with juvenile Huntington's disease. Obviously, that's not everyone that has juvenile Huntington's. We won't know of absolutely everyone, but it hopefully gives you an idea. So what are some of the things that people might see if they have juvenile Huntington's disease or see in someone with juvenile Huntington's disease? So first of all, there was generally a family history. I know there can be some situations where people maybe didn't know, or things, you know, where it comes out a bit more clearly with someone being diagnosed, but generally there will be some sort of family history of Huntington's. There'll also be some physical symptoms, so that might be things like stiffness in the legs or clumsiness of the arms and legs, speech and swallow problems, as well as maybe changes in thinking and behaviour. So you might see some changes in behaviour and personality. You might also see sort of a decline in thinking, which might be picked up in terms of things like school performance. But I think often what I'm looking for is there's often quite a collection of symptoms, so a bit of everything really, lots of different things, and also some change over time. So usually those things will get worse over time, and we'll tend to see that. So how does it compare to adult Huntington's? Again, I think there's no definitive, so different people with Huntington's, whether they're children or whether they're adults, will have different symptoms. So there isn't any sort of one definitive distinction. But in some young people with juvenile Huntington's, they can be very different to what we would usually see with adults. Equally, some adults can have some of the symptoms that we tend to associate more with younger people with Huntington's. But in sort of general terms, things like rigidity, so stiffness of movement, bradykinesia, which is slow movements, and dystonia, which is muscle spasms, are more common in younger people with HD, and particularly very young children. And then the chorea, so that's involuntary movements that we tend to see in adults with Huntington's, the cognitive changes and the psychiatric sort of mental health problems are more common in adult Huntington's. And we've always said that roughly about a quarter of people with juvenile Huntington's will have seizures, which adults tend not to have. So that's another difference. But I think our sort of knowledge about exactly the types of seizures and is quite poor. So, but there is also that element. If you read a bit around, there's a couple of things that will come up about juvenile Huntington's. So there's often a suggestion that it might have a slightly quicker progression than in adults. Now, I think the first thing to say is that everyone with Huntington's is very different, and particularly in terms of what symptoms they have and when and how quickly those changes happen, and that's true for adults and that's true for younger people as well. I think with juvenile Huntington's, there's very poor evidence of that, because I think a lot of this information has come from studies of maybe a handful of people. So that's one of the reasons why we've had such mixed evidence about it. And I think what seems to be developing now, which is what the sense I sort of had of it for a while, is that actually that might again be going back to those particularly young children who develop symptoms. The other thing that you might hear about if you're reading about juvenile Huntington's disease is that it's linked to getting Huntington's from your father. So in about 70 to 80% of young people with JHD, the father is the affected parent. Now, that's the reason for that is because the genetic change that happens in Huntington's is less stable in sperm, so that can sometimes change slightly, which can in some cases mean an earlier onset. But that doesn't mean that men pass on juvenile HD. There will be a lot of people who inherit HD from their father and they don't develop juvenile HD. But I think what it does mean is that many of the people who are caring for young people are mothers and may well be on their own. So it's a really isolating experience, and often they'll have had previous experience of Huntington's or juvenile Huntington's. So just to go over the genetics briefly, hopefully just to give, I'm not going to go into detail in the genetics because it all gets very complicated, but just to say our genes are a bit like the recipe or the code for building us. And we have this code, and a code of 3 letters makes up a protein in this recipe, makes up for a protein, and then we're built out of these proteins. So the Huntington gene, which is the one that has that when it turns faulty causes Huntington's disease, is made up of a little code CAG, and that gets repeated many times. And in Huntington's disease, there's sort of a stutter, if you like, so that gets repeated extra times. So essentially what happens is you get an enlarged protein which goes on to cause all the problems. And what we know is that there is a link between the repeat size and the age of onset. So the higher the repeat count, so the bigger the stutter, the earlier that, on average, the earlier someone will develop symptoms. So particularly very high repeat counts, over about 60, might be linked with earlier onset. But I think what's difficult is to use that to say that this is the age at which someone will go on to develop symptoms, just because different people can have different, the same repeat count, but have very different symptoms and very different ages of onset. So we do know the gene, and people can have a predictive test to see whether they're going to go on to develop Huntington's, which is called a predictive test. But usually, because Huntington's will be an adult onset condition, people will be able to choose as an adult, so over 18 years old, whether they have that test, and under 18 they can't. So people might ask, well, how does someone get diagnosed with juvenile Huntington's? So that same test can be used in a sort of a diagnostic way, but the problem is that that test can only tell you that this person has the gene. What it can't tell you is that they've got this, that these symptoms at this point in time are being caused by Huntington's. So you have to use a lot of other things. The doctors have to use a lot of other things to try and make that diagnosis. So they'll be looking at things like someone's symptoms, might even use things like brain scans to see whether it all together that gives them the diagnosis or not. But if you go back to some of the symptoms that we were talking about earlier, actually, hopefully you can see that they're very ambiguous. It's very difficult to say this is Huntington's. If you look at something like changes in behaviour, or even something like things like clumsiness, especially when they're very subtle in the early stages, they can be very difficult to put down to Huntington's. And you know, children can have lots of changes anyway, so it can be really difficult. So often there's quite a long delay in diagnosis until people are really quite sure that that's what's going on before they will look at doing this genetic test to try and help confirm things. And I think that can be a really difficult time for families, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. But I think the risk is if you jump into it too early, the first problem that can happen is that you miss other possible causes, which can create other problems, because obviously people can have other health conditions as well. And the other problem that can happen is that if you jump into it early, someone might get told that they have the gene and they are going to develop symptoms, but actually their problems at this point turn out not to be Huntington's. And in that case, they'd have their result, they'd know that they're going to go on to develop Huntington's, but they haven't made that choice to know. So this is where the caution needs to come in. The other thing is that in reality, in the situation, you know, there can be very differing views about the way forward, what's needed, what's right. So it can be quite tricky. So now what I wanted to, before I move on, what I wanted to do is just pause a moment. I've got a little film that I was hoping to show you. Hopefully this is working. Ruth, are you able to just confirm to me that you can see the screen?
Helen, it's not showing yet. The video isn't showing.
Okay. Is that showing now?
Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, so this is just a short film from a doctor called Martha Nance, who's from the HDO website. And just to point out, there is also another film, which I won't show today. It's a bit longer, so I won't show it today, but it might be worth looking at, talking about families talking about their experiences. But the one I want to show you is Martha Nance just talking about challenges when diagnosing juvenile HD.
My name is Martha Nance. I'm the medical director of the Huntington's Disease Center of Excellence at Hennepin County Medical Center in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I'm a neurologist and a geneticist. Many pediatric neurologists are not very familiar with Huntington's disease, and adult neurologists who specialize in Huntington's disease may not be all that familiar with children. So there's sometimes challenges too in recognizing the symptoms because they can be a little bit different than adults. If the first symptoms of Huntington's disease have to do with mood or irritability or behavior changes, those kind of things are so common in children as they go from being young children to adolescents anyway, that it can be hard to tell whether this is a behavior change that's caused by a disease or whether it's just normal adolescence. Apparent changes in thinking and memory may just be, sometimes you hit a bumpy year at school where you're taking classes that are difficult and you're just not doing as well as you used to, and it doesn't mean that you have a disease, but you're just hitting some more challenging classes. We'll often do every test that we can think of besides the gene test first, and then we treat depression. We make sure we've looked at the brain scan. We do cognitive testing to see how a person is functioning right now so that we have something to compare to in 6 months or 2 years in case there's a change. And then we have the child come back in 6 months or a year. If the child is developing Huntington's disease, this is a disease that progresses. So in 6 months or a year or 2 years, there will be changes for the worse, even if we've done everything we can to optimize the home situation or to treat the depression. So we often wait 6 months or a year or even more before we leap to doing the gene test. There's one big reason that we pause before doing a gene test in a child, and that is that the gene test doesn't tell you whether the person is currently having symptoms of Huntington's disease or not. So you want to be pretty sure that the symptoms that you're seeing are really Huntington's disease symptoms, or you're basically doing a predictive gene test. If a child were to come in, for instance, complaining of headaches and blurry vision and upset stomach, if the doctor said, oh, you're at risk for Huntington's disease, let's do the gene test, even if the child tests positive, well, those aren't symptoms of Huntington's disease. So you've just done a predictive gene test, and you still don't know why the child is having headaches and upset stomach and blurry vision. There's, I think, great potential harm to a child like that who went in with a headache, came out knowing that they have a HD gene mutation that is of a size that's likely to cause HD when they're 50 or 30, and here they are 15 years old, and now they know they have the Huntington's gene, but they still don't have an answer to why they're having the symptoms that they're having. We really don't want to do that in a kid. We want children to grow up to be young adults and to be able to decide for themselves whether they want to have a predictive gene test or not.
Okay, so hopefully that explored that a little bit more. So I'll go back to the PowerPoint now. Yeah, and hopefully you can see that. So what I want to move on to look at now is really kind of how juvenile HD impacts on the family. So what I'm doing here is summarising some of the work that we did looking at that. We did a study back a while ago now, back in the UK, looking into the impact of juvenile Huntington's disease. That was then extended to 4 European countries, which were Holland, Italy, Poland and Sweden. In the UK, we did 10 interviews, which was 12 people. And in the European study, we talked to 14 people. And they were really, what we were trying to do is we've got an idea of some of the things that were coming up for families. And then we were looking at different cultural groups and different healthcare systems to see if those same sort of issues were coming up. And these were the ones that kind of came up across the board. So the first thing that people seemed to talk a lot about was that time of early signs where they were noticing small things through to the diagnosis. And as we've mentioned, that was a difficult time for a lot of people. So they talked about these very sort of subtle early signs that they could spot. So things like clumsiness, coordination, losing skills that they'd maybe had before, or just sort of cognitive difficulties. So changes to thinking. And importantly, it was kind of how those were changing as well over time. But during that time, I think, as I say, as parents were becoming sort of aware and maybe trying to reach out for support, I think sometimes what they felt when they were being told when with this delay, they kind of, what they were hearing was that they were imagining things, they were maybe feeling blamed and unsupported. So I think it is important that we look at how we support people during this time. The answer probably isn't rushing things, as I was explaining and as Martha Nance was explaining, but I think there is something, as Martha was saying, about regularly reviewing, trying to offer support, maybe looking at how we can manage some of the specific issues which don't necessarily require a diagnosis, but just trying to see if we can find a way to support families at this time. The next big thing was isolation. I think families felt that they were very isolated from other people. I think it was very difficult. It's very difficult for other people to understand what they're going through. On the one hand, people may know that there's HD in the family. They may know that that young person has juvenile HD. But I think there's one thing is that, and one thing is really getting what that means to be that person, or to be the parent or a loved one of that person. And also, I think it can be difficult to ask for help. I think, again, if anyone who's going through a difficult time will understand that sometimes, you know, other people have their own problems and commitments. Sometimes you feel you don't want to burden other people. So it can be difficult to ask for help as well. Things that seem to create isolation for the young person is sort of features of the condition were, you know, as they were becoming increasingly dependent on their family, and communication difficulties were a particularly isolating area, as well as sometimes challenging behaviour as well, as could be. I think it's also worth remembering that often, you know, there's Huntingtons in the wider family. So that can impact on the sort of support that you can get from the wider family, as you know, they'll have their own circumstances and situations sometimes that make that difficult. And then I don't want to forget about siblings, because I think they're sometimes a bit the hidden people in all of this. And you know, and I think every year we do an annual family weekend, and it always reminds me of quite how an impact it's having on siblings. And just to mention that we do have our youth worker who can help support siblings. And then knowledge and understanding, or lack of people's knowledge and understanding, is also something that came up time and time again. So as I was saying, people might know about the juvenile Huntingtons in the family, but not really know what that means. So an example might be at school, might be aware of the diagnosis, but not really understand how some of those symptoms, those changes to thinking and behaviour can lead to maybe real difficulties in getting that young person into school. You know, they might be refusing to go, for example, and kind of quite how all that feeds into, the symptoms feed into that. Also, families tended to become experts. There was a lot of talk about this, and they would have to take on the responsibility for educating, just as they were trying to make sense of the symptoms, their situation, you know, learning all about it themselves, and that could be really difficult. So I think it's important to be honest. I think people found it very frustrating when people pretended they knew more than they did. But so being honest about knowledge of juvenile Huntington's and really listening to the families who are building up this expertise. And then finally, looking in terms of support. So as I said, and I think this was certainly a bit of a double-edged sword in a way, in that there were lots of interactions that could be really helpful, but certainly others that could create uncertainty, worry, or, you know, misleading information, for example. So listening to the family, being honest about how much we do or don't know. Some of it was just about good care, basically. So, you know, coordination, consistency of support, and good communication with the family. And what families wanted was access to services that had expertise and knowledge about the condition. Another important part was about managing transitions as the child grew older, and finding appropriate services, and particularly respite and some form of break, and not just any respite, something that gave the family and young person a break, but where it was somewhere that age appropriate, that was that the young person would enjoy, and that was fun, and that they felt that they were safe as well. And then the other thing that came up was peer support, and certainly with everyone being quite spread out, that's always been quite a challenge, but there's a lot more online tools now for families to stay in touch, and as I mentioned, I'll talk a bit more about it in a minute, but we do have our family weekend, but I think this time in a way is also moving things on in terms of online support. So we're certainly looking at how we can all stay in touch with using online, you know, video meetings and calls and things, which in this, when everyone's so spread out, as I say, is particularly helpful. One of the areas that causes a lot of issues is often behavioural changes, but just to start off by saying, it doesn't happen in every child with juvenile Huntington's disease, but it can in some. And as I say, if you're familiar with HD, you'll know that it can be part of HD generally. So I think what becomes really difficult is knowing what is Huntington's disease, what is the part of the changes of the condition, what's normal teenage behaviour. I mean, children are changing all the time. So what is normal teenage behaviour? And what's a reaction to perhaps the diagnosis or family circumstances? HD can bring many stresses into family life, which children may have had going on. So, and I think, as I said, we know HD changes behaviour in adults, but I think it's particularly difficult to tease all that apart when it's someone younger, because you've got these extra factors to play in. But certainly some of the information, the knowledge that we know about managing, you know, those changes to behaviour in adults can be really helpful. So there's lots of resources that we can point you in the direction, explaining kind of how those, you know, what causes some of these issues and what we can do to help. And the other big thing that's perhaps particular to juvenile HD is in terms of school. So generally, being at school is really helpful for the child. So it gives them a routine, it helps keep them active, which we know is really important, and gives them access to their peers and sort of friends. But also, it gives respite, actually. And I know it's not the main goal of education, but often it provides a very regular break for the family and the young person. So can be really helpful. But there are challenges with juvenile HD in a school, and so support is needed. But just a couple of quick tips. Generally, the earlier changes are made, the better. And trying to be flexible, you know, with the curriculum, etc. HD requires a lot of flexibility. So this is an exercise I sometimes do, and I think we can all probably picture what an average mainstream secondary school's like. So just some of the things that might come up are things like, you know, it's a very large building, different levels, busy corridors, lots of other students going around, so it's a very busy environment, lots of different subjects, different books, changes of classroom, different teachers, busy eating areas, a very long day, homework, so quite full on. And then if you start thinking about some of the difficulties that someone with HD has, it's almost, I think, quite a uniquely challenging environment in many ways. So I think it's just worth bearing in mind. So some of the things that can help, and again, these are sort of tips that will help in lots of different other environments as well. So whichever environment you're talking about, you know, there may be some tips as to how to help. So having information and understanding of HD can be really useful for those who are supporting the young person and the family. Adaptations to the school, and those are going to benefit lots of people, whether, you know, in lots of different ways. So making changes to make things more accessible, and as I say, lots of benefits for everyone. Having a buddy or one-to-one staff support can be really helpful. Familiar routines, breaking down tasks so it's not too much to try and take in at once. Patience and a little extra time. Having a quieter environment, so reducing sort of all the stimulating things that are going on and distractions, so trying to keep things quieter and calmer. Having somewhere where that young person can have a bit of quieter time if they're getting tired or if it's getting overwhelming. So sometimes that might be somewhere like a sick bay, or just somewhere where they know they can have a bit of space if they need it. As I mentioned, flexibility, particularly thinking about the curriculum. So rather than trying to keep, you know, the pressure to keep up with a certain curriculum, what does the child enjoy, and focusing on that. Simple rules and goals, trying to identify triggers for any behaviour. Regular snacks between meals. So with the school day, obviously there's quite a limited lunchtime. By the time that young person has got to wherever they're going to have their lunch, got themselves set up, it takes them longer to eat. They've maybe got to queue in a canteen. So all of that means that actually they don't have a very big amount of time to do that. And equally, there might be rules about snacks and things in the school. So making sure that young person has that opportunity to keep their energy up. We know that that's important with HD. Extra time to move between classes and for meal times, leaving a bit earlier, for example. Regular multidisciplinary reviews or team meetings, so that all the different people involved, whether that's a speech and language therapist, a physiotherapist, that they're all involved, and there's regular sort of interaction with the school or wherever that young person is. Because I think, you know, teachers aren't going to generally be medical experts. So in terms of having confidence that they know what to do with certain aspects of the condition, you know, they're going to be with that child a lot, or young person a lot of the time. So really important that they feel that they've got that support from the team, and everyone's involved. And then moving on from school, actually transition. At some point, there's often going to be a move from children's to adult services. And I think that can be quite a big change, both in terms of the teams that are involved, but also the sort of services that are available, and particularly planning for that end of school college. You know, I think people will often go from a time where they've got a very good routine, a very strong team around them, to actually a big sort of gap, if you like, with that. And that can be, you know, if you think of a typical day centre, for example, often that's going to have a lot of older adults rather than people of a similar age. So it's finding things that are appropriate, and making sure that that's planned for, so that they don't just sort of stop and then there's that sort of gap. I think the other thing that I've seen is just to be aware that it can be a time when the condition is progressing. There's quite a lot of changes going on, and actually if that's a time when your usual team is stepping back and the adult services aren't quite sort of up and running with the situation by that point, that can be quite difficult. And then finally, just to go through, there's a few sort of resources that might be helpful. So both on our website, there's quite a few pages with information about juvenile HD, but also on the Huntington's Disease Youth Organisation. So as I say, I showed that film from Martha Nance. There was another one that might be helpful. And then there is a book through Oxford University Press that might be helpful, as well as a guide to juvenile HD, both from the Huntington's Disease Society of America, as well as the Huntington Society of Canada. And then I can't not do this without mentioning Sheenam's Wish. So Sheenam is a very special lady who has juvenile HD, and for her 30th birthday wanted to raise a large amount of money to be able to give fun to young people with juvenile HD. So if anyone knows someone who might be able to, who would like to apply for that, they can always get in touch with me and I can make that happen. So just a quick word on my role. So I'm the specialist advisor, and my role is to offer information, advice and support for families, and training for advice and training for professionals. I work very much alongside our local specialist advisors because they'll have a wealth of information about the local area and local teams, as well as our youth worker to support in terms of siblings. But also there are some situations where there's a young person, they haven't necessarily had a diagnosis of juvenile HD, but there's just some questions and they're just finding things difficult. So in terms of trying to offer support to them as well. And as I mentioned, we do hold a weekend once a year for families to come together at a disabled activity centre, and it is a fantastic weekend. So we usually have about 12 or 13 families come, about 60 people, and we do some fantastic activities like canoeing, rock climbing, horse riding over the weekend, and the parents get a chance to kind of mix and chat separately so that they have a chance to share as well. And then we have a great evening on the Saturday evening. And I think what's brilliant now is obviously with the online formats, we can stay in touch in between as well. So even though we're spread apart, we can still stay in touch and offer support to each other. So that's the end of the presentation, but I've just got one final film that I wanted to show. And which just shows a little bit about this weekend that I mentioned.
It's very helpful for us as a family coming to the Huntington's Disease Weekend at the Calvert Trust. It's beneficial because we get to see other families that's in similar predicaments, similar situations. We're able to help some of the families that are kind of lost and don't know exactly what services they should be chasing or what's kind of coming next.
It's been wonderful to meet other families. Like this says, children's activities they do, they get looked after. Parents have their own time and share experiences, how they're coping.
For us as parents to have the opportunity of having a good cry, of having a good share, of sharing the research, of sharing what's going in our lives is an incredibly valuable experience. As soon as we've gone from here, we want to be booking the next year.
It's one of the only times that we can kind of relax a little. The environment's safe for the boys. We know that there's carers around that are aware of the ins and outs of Huntington's disease that we're not going to find anywhere else, basically. And it means that we can relax a little bit with the girls. We're not kind of constantly kind of guarding Jamie against other people looking and staring and whatever might be said and stuff.
Everybody's the same here. Nobody stares at you. Nobody has any comments to make about them. They all enjoy being together, and that's one of the main things, just being together with each other, knowing that you are all the same.
The joy, the laughter, the fun, just for a weekend being able to just let go and seeing the young people have the opportunity of just in a safe environment being themselves. It's fantastic, it really is.
The children absolutely love coming to the weekend. There's so many activities and that they can get involved with. They do the canoeing, rock climbing. Last year they did horse riding. There's a fantastic pool here, a sensory pool, plays music underwater, and there's various lights and stuff. And it's very stimulating, especially for some of the more affected patients, you know.
Cherries is our first visit to this family weekend. After arriving here, only yesterday, I asked her twice, how do you feel about coming here? Oh, it's wonderful. I said, so next time you won't say no coming here. And she said, no, it's so wonderful.
They achieve a lot of things. They achieve friendships, socialisation. They do a lot of activities, and they're smiling.